Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Landmark Chambers General Election Result Opportunities and Challenges webinar. We are delighted to see so many of you to join us for the session today and hope that you find these presentations and discussions useful and informative. My name is Ashley Bowes and I will chair the session today, joined by my colleagues Zack Simons and Isabella Buono at Landmark Chambers. And we are thrilled to be also joined by Nikita of Town Legal, and I will introduce them properly as we go through the thematic chapters of today. We have a new government, a new Labour government, for those of you who have tuned into the seminar to receive the news of the day. And that is, of course, the first Labour administration for 14 years. And with impeccable timing, as the new Prime Minister has just concluded his initial remarks to the country outside number 10, we now have assembled an expert panel to guide you through the following initial topics. So we're going to look at plan making, we're going to look at development management, some broader changes, and then we're going to conclude by some horizon scanning and think about what longer range issues might be done. And I'm going to kick off this session by looking at plan making, which has been such a major issue for so many people over the last 14 years or so. The first thing to say, and probably the most immediate change that our industry will notice, is the deletion, removal, revocation, whichever route, of the December 2023 National Planning Policy Framework. The current government, as they are, describe that in their manifesto as a damaging Conservative change, and it is their initial indication that they wish to restore mandatory housing targets. So I think what that means is that the 2023 framework will be removed. It may be done through introducing a consultation on a yet further iteration of the framework, but perhaps more likely it may be done by some more immediate mechanism, by simply issuing a written ministerial statement to say that that has been withdrawn and that the 2021 framework is the one to use for all purposes. It is, of course, the case that the 2021 framework is being used up and down the country at the moment for plan making purposes. A number of plans that were submitted before December 2023 are still being examined under that 21 version. It is less clear, it seems to me, what happens for those planning authorities who decided to wait and submit under the 2023 framework. The language of the manifesto, at least, and everything that we've heard around it suggests there is unlikely to be a transition period or a particularly sympathetic one. And it looks very much like those authorities would be reverting to the 21 framework, but of course, we do not know. It could also be a signal to broader return to regional planning. It's notable, of course, that regional strategies remain on the statute book. They were never deleted. They're still there as part of the statutory definition of the development plan. And of course, there are some in the southeast where I'm sitting, where they are still in force, at least in relation to one saved policy about Thames Basin Heaths. But we know all of this is with a view to deliver, so the government says, a staggeringly ambitious 1.5 million new homes over the course of the next Parliament. So the second thing to say in terms of plan making is the government says it will not be afraid to ensure local authorities have an up-to-date plan by making full use of their intervention powers. And of course, the incoming ministers have an extensive set of powers available to them. They can, as the statute stands at the moment, already direct an authority to prepare a plan. They can do it themselves if they want under Section 27 of the 2004 Act. They can direct an authority to modify a development plan document that's currently in gestation, and they can direct an authority not to adopt a document or not to withdraw a document from examination. And of course, we've seen some limited use of those powers under the previous Conservative administration anyway. I think this means that we can all expect to see a far more muscular approach to exercising intervention powers. That is very much likely to have an immediate effect, or certainly feel like an immediate effect on plan making. We are likely to see, it seems to me, that the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act powers, which are currently pending, to enable ministers to prescribe a timetable in which a local plan must be adopted to be brought into effect, and for that timetable to be specified. I don't know what Labour's position would be on how long that timetable would be. It would be, of course, it might be what the previous Conservative government thought, which was 30 months plus 4 months, but it may well be a shorter period. Although all of this comes with, I think, a need to acknowledge there would need to be additional funding in the system, either through additional officials at DCLG to administer this whole process, or rather at a local level. But the government seems to be aware of that, and it says that it's going to fund at least some of this through increasing stamp duty surcharge on non-UK residents. Just how much that's going to raise, it's not entirely clear, and whether there would need to be more funding in the system to make it all work. But I think the overall message from what we can see already in the manifesto is that for those of you who have been very sensibly waiting to push the button on some of those more controversial sites in Greenbelt, now is the time. I think that, as we'll see in a moment, Greenbelt will likely remain a constraint, but there is likely to be a more nuanced approach to it. So turning to Greenbelt then, I think what is immediately clear is that with the removal of the 2023 framework, the suggestion that the Greenbelt as a location for growth to accommodate housing needs as a discretionary area of investigation has gone. I think also the advisory nature of the standard method as a starting point for calculating housing need will also go. And I think, as I said, we are now going to look at what's going to be a more nuanced approach to Greenbelt. There are references to assessments of Greenbelt being performed at a strategic level, which I think likely translates as meaning it's going to be at a sub-regional level of assessment to investigate the purposes and performance of the Greenbelt. There is a signal that's been widely reported that lower quality Greenbelts will be prioritised for development, known as grey belts. And this appears to be, although it's not been defined what that means, but it appears to be something different to purely previously developed land. It's going to be something more than brownfield, because the government tells us in terms in the manifesto that brownfield land alone will not solve the housing crisis. So I think it is very likely to include areas of weaker performing, currently underdeveloped greenfield sites in the Greenbelt. I think we can therefore expect to see, perhaps through policy, perhaps through formal directions, a more sequential, expressly sequential approach to development in the Greenbelt, still brownfield first, then followed by areas of weaker performing Greenbelt, so-called grey belt, and then falling back onto what we would commonly understand now to be Greenbelt. We're told that this will all be subject to golden rules to ensure, quotes, development benefits communities and nature. And I think that's a very clear signal that for anybody thinking of preparing and promoting a site, they need to have a very good biodiversity net gain offer, and they need to have a well thought through and coherent plan for community infrastructure, perhaps on site, or if that's impracticable, a very clear explanation as to how that's going to be delivered and integrated to the surrounding area. I said at the beginning that it's going to be a more nuanced approach to Greenbelt. I don't think it's going to be a relaxed approach to Greenbelt. And I say that for several reasons. First of all, throughout the manifesto, there's still a strong emphasis on local communities shaping house building in their area. And there's also the express statement that Labour is committed to preserving Greenbelt. And so, as I said, it's very likely to maintain a very significant constraint on housing delivery, and it's still going to require some careful thought how to promote sites in the Greenbelt. And the final thing I wanted to say before I hand over to Isabella is to talk about nutrient neutrality. A line in the manifesto that suggests that the government is going to unlock building of homes without weakening environmental protections, a la nutrient neutrality. Those astute amongst you will know that the Court of Appeal has handed down the C.G. Fry judgment, explaining how the habitat regulations work in a nutshell. The appropriate assessment can be required at the discharge of condition stage and at the reserve matters stage, on which there is an extremely good webinar, I'm told, on the 15th of July by my colleagues Richard Moores, Nick Grant, Luke Wilcox, myself and David Elvin. But what content and form that unlocking of house building without compromising environmental protections is going to take unexplained, but I think a very strong clue will be in the amendment that the Labour Party put in the Lords to the Conservative amendment to the Levelling Up Bill last summer, and the accompanying letter to the Times by Angela Rayner, who is very likely, if not already, installed as the Secretary of State for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. And that had a number of features to it. It said that Labour would require nutrient neutrality mitigation as a pre-commencement condition. It would expedite mitigation credits. It would introduce delay in provision of mitigation measures in exchange for strategic mitigation actions by house builders. And then this, which perhaps may raise an eyebrow amongst those who have particular emphasis on the environmental protection side, it's to determine or resolve that affordable housing development in a nutrient-affected catchment area would constitute an imperative reason of overriding public interest, i.e. a way of overriding the otherwise exclusive provisions of the habitat regulations. And they would support pollution reduction at source and produce guidelines on nutrient mitigation plans. All of this, however, doesn't seem to acknowledge that some of the major contributors in farming and water infrastructure perhaps need greater attention. The HBF report in 2023 tells us that new housing development accounts for only 0.29% of nitrogen emissions and 0.73% of total phosphorus, which make up nutrients. And that's, of course, compared to 70% for farming activities. And the interesting statistic that each dairy cow discharges the equivalent of 29 homes and each sheep of 3 family homes of nutrients. So we hope that any new plan for dealing with nutrient neutrality recognises the key contributors to the problem. So those are my initial thoughts on plan making. I'm now going to switch over and introduce you to Isabella Buono, who is going to guide you through development management implications. Isabella has a broad practice, including inquiries, CPOs, and valuation, as well as participating and acting for a number of parties in environmental judicial review. She's ranked second in Planning Magazine's list of top-rated junior planning barristers under 35, and in the top 10 of junior planning barristers overall. And I can't think of a better person to guide us through the development management implications of the new Labour government. Isabella.
Thanks, Ashley. On the development management side of things, I think there are 4 headline points to draw out, and they relate to the presumption in favour of sustainable development, brownfield, grey belts, which Ashley's already touched on, and then also potentially something on design. Some of those 4 points will involve more of a change from the existing position than others. And I think all of them, though, are capable of being changed relatively quickly, or at least more quickly than some of the longer term changes that Zack's going to cover later in the webinar, including on new towns. So first on the presumption, I think that's one of the areas where we saw the clearest indications of real change to the framework in the manifesto, where we were told that a Labour government would reform and strengthen the presumption in favour of sustainable development. That will presumably require changes to what's currently paragraph 11 of the NPPF, but we're not told in the manifesto what those changes might look like. So we're still waiting to find out what the reforming and strengthening will actually be. I think one of the likely candidates, if not the most likely candidate, is to revisit the trigger for engaging the tilted balance, which is to say to change the circumstances in which footnote 8 tells us that the most important policies for determining an application will be out of date. as Ashley already flagged, we've already been told that Labour will undo damaging Conservative changes to the framework, those being their words, in relation to the 2023 changes. So presumably we're going to see a change back to the tilted balance being engaged, where there's no 5-year housing land supply and not just 4 years in some cases. Another option for reforming and strengthening the presumption might be to have another look at the footnote 7 policies, which is those policies which provide a clear reason for refusal under 11D1 so as to disengage the tilted balance in 11D2. Greenbelt policy could, for example, be removed from that list, which would mean that the determinative test for at least some greenbelt sites would be whether or not the adverse impacts of the scheme significantly and demonstrably outweighed by its benefits, as opposed to the very special circumstances test, which is, of course, much more difficult to satisfy. I think given the way that the wider Greenbelt programme or debate has been set up, I think that's probably less likely to be what they've got in mind. The push seems to be to review Greenbelt boundaries and then within Greenbelt boundaries to differentiate between Greybelt land and genuinely green Greenbelt land, rather than to make it easier to get permission on Greenbelt signs across the board or in general terms. But certainly different options on the table that hopefully we'll see in revised policy wording not too far down the line. So that's the presumption in favour of sustainable development. The second point on the list was brownfield land. We were told in the manifesto that the new government will take a brownfield first approach, prioritising the development of PDL wherever possible. That's, of course, really nothing new at all. Brownfield first has, of course, been a thread that's run through for a long time, at least since John Prescott's Planning for New Communities back in 98. It's also a favoured refrain of the government, the most recent government, particularly over the last year or so. And it's, of course, already reflected in the framework, including in paragraph 123, which tells authorities to make as much use as possible of previously developed or brownfield land, and footnote 27, which indicates an overarching objective on the part of the government to prioritise brownfield and other underutilised urban sites. So brownfield first, nothing new, and no real policy changes, I think, required to give effect to that. Something that's potentially is new on brownfield is the proposal to fast track approval of urban brownfield sites. The detail as to what that will involve remains to be seen. It wasn't set out in the manifesto, but presumably will need to tie in with the wider commitments that have been made in terms of providing additional resourcing to authorities. On Greybelt, something Ashley's already touched on, that's going to be a new designation that the government is going to need to revise the NPPF in order to introduce. We've been told, as Ashley said, that it'll be distinct to brownfield and with a wider definition, and will include disused car parks, presumably alongside many other things. As Ashley said, the thrust seems to be to introduce some kind of new sequential test with brownfield greenbelt land at the top of the tree, non-brownfield greybelt land second, and then finally greybelt environmentally valuable or genuinely green belt third. It's not clear, I think, on the manifesto whether that's a sequential approach that will apply only at the plan making stage, or whether that's something that's intended to be introduced at the decision taking stage as well, so that those applicants with non-greybelt greenbelt sites will have to show that there aren't greybelt or brownfield sites available to them. It's also not clear how or whether the government intends to dilute or even disengage the very special circumstances test for proposals on greybelt land. If the intention is, as we're told, to differentiate between greybelt and genuinely greenbelt, then I think it would presumably make sense to have a different policy test applicable at the decision-taking stage. But again, we're going to have to wait for draft revised policy wording to work out how this is actually going to work in practice. The final DM point I wanted to cover relates to design, in particular the comment in the manifesto where we were told that Labour wants exemplary development to be the norm, not the exception. We weren't told what, if any, changes to the framework that would require, and presumably the answer may well be none, because of course ambitions for high quality design are already baked into the framework throughout. Still, at the risk of reading too much into a single word in a single sentence of the manifesto, I think it's potentially interesting that they chose to use that word exemplary. Perhaps there's a hint there, and it would be no more than a hint, that the new government intends to move away from the subjective notion of beauty that was introduced back in 2021, and perhaps replace it with a more objective and potentially also more workable policy test on the basis of design being either exemplary or not. But again, that's something that we don't know yet, and we'll have to wait to see. So those are the headline points on development management that I wanted to cover for now. And then I think Nikita's got a longer list of wide-ranging changes that are on the horizon.
Thank you ever so much, Isabella, for that. Yes, Nikita Sellers, Senior Associate at Town Legal, advises on all aspects of planning, composes purchase law, and acts for a wide range of clients on large-scale, complex mixed-use planning applications. She has experience of drafting and negotiating planning and highways agreements and acts for clients on a variety of contentious matters, including planning appeal and judicial review proceedings. Along with her colleagues at Town Legal, she hosts a regular planning podcast, Planning Law with Chickens, and contributes to a blog on developments in compulsory purchase law and practice compulsory reading. And over to you, Nikita.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Very good to be here. I've been asked to talk about broader changes to expect from this new government, and I am going to really focus on housing, because broader changes could obviously cover a huge number of things. So I'm going to focus on housing because we've got a new government today that's very pro-house building. In fact, Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves said in the Times last weekend that they intend to hit the ground running with the plans for house building from today, day one. So we're looking at, as everyone has alluded to, a 1.5 million homes target during this 5-year parliamentary term. And Ashley and Isabella have already told you about some of the plans to boost house building through changes to the NPPF and Greenbelt Review. I also don't want to preempt what Zack has to say about new towns. But what else can we expect? The first thing I want to talk about is that we're going to expect a big push on social and affordable housing. Keir Starmer emphasised this in his speech just before we came on, and Labour told us in their manifesto that they intend to deliver the biggest increase in social and affordable housing in a generation. They also say that they intend to increase protections on newly built social housing by reviewing the right to buy discounts. Although it seems that Labour's focus is really on delivery of new social and affordable housing to ensure that every home sold through right to buy is properly replaced. We also know that Labour intend to strengthen planning obligations. They say that in their manifesto. And putting these two things together, clearly planning obligations are the mechanism through which a lot of social and affordable housing is delivered. And I think if we go back to a briefing released ahead of Angela Rayner's speech at the Labour Party conference in the autumn, I think it can help us to really understand what lies behind this, because there's not much detail on it in their manifesto, as I say, other than strengthening planning obligations and delivering social and affordable housing. So what did they say then? Well, they said that they talked about increasing transparency around the viability process for the development of new affordable and social housing by creating guidance and viability levels across different parts of the country. And they also talked about a model viability assessment form that developers and councils can use when evaluating this. So that might be something that we see. And I think the intention is that developers will only be able to challenge their affordable housing commitments where there are genuine barriers to delivery. I think it's important to touch on resourcing here when we're talking about strengthening obligations and viability, because I think resourcing is going to affect these plans in a couple of ways. It's all well and good strengthening obligations, but overcoming viability challenges often requires sensible negotiations between officers and developers, and that requires sufficient expertise. Labour also say that they're prepared to take tough action, but local planning authorities need the resource to take that tough action for breaches of obligations, and they aren't able to do that without planning officers. And we all know local authority planning departments are chronically under-resourced. There was, I think, a 60% decline in local authority net spending per person over a 10-year period under the Tories. There's also a real lack of lawyers with sufficient planning expertise within local planning authorities to actually draft the Section 106 obligations themselves. I only really speak from experience on that rather than any kind of data, but we are finding a lot of local authorities that don't have any dedicated in-house planning lawyers. So proper resourcing is critical. In terms of what Labour are going to do about resourcing? Well, they have committed to appoint 300 new planning officers. That would work out, though, as less than one new officer per planning authority if that was spread evenly across the country. So to be honest, it will barely touch the sides. Labour have a very healthy majority, so I wonder if there's other things that they could be doing. Maybe they will look at ring fencing planning application fees. It's certainly something that they've said so far, but there are obviously real needs to boost resourcing. And something else they could look at is maybe specific multi-year funding packages for local authority planning functions to get the system moving as it needs to. Just to move on then, another thing I want to talk about is looking at reform to compulsory purchase and compensation rules, because this is absolutely something that Labour are looking to use to improve land assembly, speed up delivery of housing, particularly social and affordable, as I've already been talking about, as well as deliver the new infrastructure that's needed to support it. This is something that will require, this sort of reforms they have in mind will require primary legislation. And I think it's something that Keir Starmer is likely to introduce in the King's speech on the 17th of July. What we know so far is that for specific types of development schemes, Labour tell us that landowners should be awarded fair compensation rather than inflated prices based on the prospect of planning permission. During the campaign, the Shadow Housing Minister, Matthew Pennycook, told us what Labour meant by fair compensation, and that is the market price of the land rather than inflated prices which are linked to the prospect of planning permission in the future. So I think that sounds a lot like existing use value or possibly EUV plus, but certainly not hope value. From a legal perspective, these changes they're looking at shouldn't be too difficult to bring forward. We've got Section 190 of the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act already. This introduces the ability for acquiring authorities, although only certain public sector authorities like local authorities and Homes England, to disapply the current Section 14 of the Land Compensation Act 1961, so that hope value, which includes appropriate alternative development, cannot be considered when the value of the land is assessed for compensation purposes. And at the moment, this applies to certain types of CPO only. Those certain types of CPO are affordable housing, hospital health facilities, education provision, or a mixed-use scheme that includes any of those types of uses. But it wouldn't be that difficult to widen the types of CPOs that this abolition of hope value applies to more acquiring authorities and more types of CPO. I won't make any comment today on whether such changes would be justifiable, equitable, or compatible with human rights. There's certainly been some criticisms as to whether it would be compatible with Article 1 of the First Protocol as well as Article 8. But as I say, I leave that discussion for another day. But certainly it seems like that's something that they could push through. And another thing that I think they're looking at about in terms of wider reform to CPO is the plan to legislate so that public bodies can use CPO powers more easily to acquire land without the need, Matthew Pennycook said, for individual approvals by a Secretary of State. And it's not clear whether this is them planning to do away with the right to be heard at public inquiry. They don't say that. It might be much lighter touch than that, but certainly it's something that they're considering. It's not something in their manifesto. It's something that Mr. Pennycook said during the campaign. He said that these new powers would only be used in limited instances where development is required in an area, but individual landowners refuse to sell land at a fair price, and a clear public interest test would have to be met. But those sort of tests that he mentioned sound a lot like the legal tests for all CPOs, I thought, anyway. It's worth saying that Labour have such a majority that means they can deliver bold and radical reform to CPO and compensation rules if they want to. And I expect them to do this quite quickly if given the 5-year timescales that they're targeting for delivery. Just before I finish, recognising I was tasked with looking at broader changes that we can expect from this government, I just want to mention a couple of other things about their plans to support home ownership specifically. They've got plans for a new freedom to buy mortgage guarantee scheme that essentially sees the government act as a guarantor for people unable to save for big deposits. That was actually a scheme, I think, that was first introduced by the Tories to support offers for mortgages with a 5% deposit, but it disappeared in recent years. We can also expect Labour to announce the details of its first dibs scheme. This is an approach to marketing that essentially gives local people first dibs on new homes in their areas. You may already be familiar with this in principle. In London, I think it's been around. It was launched in 2018, as a voluntary scheme, where some house builders have restricted marketing and sales of new homes up to £350,000, but it hasn't really been hugely implemented. I assume the Labour scheme that they mention in their manifesto, the First Dibs scheme, will be similar to this, but it's unclear whether it will be mandatory and how it will apply. What is very clear is the government wants new homes to be delivered, lots of them, and in terms of broader changes, it wants people to be able to afford to buy those homes. I think that's it from me.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Nikita. Brilliant stuff. So finally, Zack Simons. Zack barely needs introduction. He is ranked top of the Planning Magazine survey of the Junior Planning Bar. He has an extensive track record of successfully representing parties at planning appeals on some of the most complex and challenging and constrained sites, as well as maintaining a frequent appearance in some of the leading cases in the NHS contributions cases and the CG Fry nutrient neutrality cases. So the best person really for us to wind up what we have to say, to scan the horizon and see what might be coming as some longer changes. Zack.
Thank you very much, Ashley, and good afternoon, everyone. What a time to be having this fascinating conversation, and it's been very lively already in the questions section on your Zoom calls. Lots of interesting thoughts, lots of perhaps healthy skepticism on there too, and maybe when we get to the questions bit after I finish speaking, we can delve into some of your skeptical opinions. It'd be fair to say that the two big things I'm going to mention now that relate to the longer term picture rather than things that Labour are going to be able to do overnight, strategic planning and new towns, are neither of them new ideas. There is an element of back to the future about both of them. And I think that in both cases, I think the question for us, certainly for the more sceptical among you, is going to be, all right, even if it is pulled off, how much can it deliver and by when? On strategic planning, you will remember, or some of you may remember, that the arrival of New Labour way back when, in 1997, led to the Barker Review in 2003, which led to stronger top-down, quote-unquote, targets for housing imposed through regional spatial strategies, as was. And certainly when I think about in some ways, the downfall of everything that's gone wrong in planning in the last 14 years, to me, all roads lead to the Localism Act and the abolition of regional plans as they were the strategic tier of planning by Eric Nichols through that piece of legislation, without anything sensible to replace them. As I think we all know, if you're going to do the kind of proper infrastructure-led placemaking through the planning system that everybody seems to say that they want, restricting spatial planning to the tier of local planning authorities and indeed to neighbourhoods just isn't going to work. It hasn't worked. The duty to cooperate that sought to replace regional plans has been a disastrous mechanism that's managed to be at the same time useless and incredibly obstructive. We've spoken a bit about the grey belt already today. Maybe we'll do some more of that in the questions. But if there are to be reviews of green belt areas, as the new government has said that it wants, it's imperative that happen at a strategic level if you want to get sensible results. One of the weirdest quirks of the post-Localism Act era is that you've got individual local planning authorities making ad hoc and sometimes inconsistent decisions from their neighbours on things like Greenbelt, when Greenbelt is, by its very nature, a macro, transboundary, strategic, spatial mechanism. So for all sorts of reasons, there's a very powerful rationale to push plan making at a strategic level outside London, where, of course, planning at a strategic level is happening already. The Levelling Up and Regeneration Act provides a legal structure that we've already got to do this, to bring about strategic planning. It provides for joint spatial development strategies. It provides for joint local plans. Joint local plans are an option. They're a may, not a must for local planning authorities, but there is the power already in the statute for the Secretary of State to intervene and to compel local planning authorities to get together and plan jointly. But at the moment, there's no power to compel or to intervene for the Secretary of State in relation to joint spatial development strategies, the frameworks that would sit on top of local plans coming forward. That is something that could change. It would require primary legislation. It would be one way of bringing about a mandatory strategic tier of planning, if that's what the new Secretary of State wants to do, and that's certainly what they've said they want to do, would be by tweaking the provisions in respect of joint spatial development strategies in LoRa. Of course, the benefits of strategic planning can be profound, but we need to be realistic. We certainly need to be realistic about timings. As I've indicated already, there would need to be some kind of change in primary legislation. And as you've all seen in the way that the Levelling Up Act came forward, that can take time. It can take months. It can take years. And we'd hope that something like this wouldn't take years, but it certainly can do. The plans themselves, if and when the legislation has been changed, are important. They will be controversial, of course they will. And you'll all know that at the moment, although we all have, or the government, certainly our old government, had aspirations to cut down the time that it takes to adopt a local plan. The average is 7 years from beginning to end, which is obviously unacceptable. So strategic planning is an important tool, I think, for the future. It's certainly one that our new government intends to put some stock in. It's critical. But realistically, are, say, homes or infrastructure going to be delivered pursuant to strategic plans, say, within the first Parliament, 5-year period? No. Which leads me on to the second big picture item in the Labour manifesto, new towns. Now, in Clem Attlee's post-war government, as lots of you will know already, the planning system through the 1947 Act was only one side of a two-sided coin. The other side was the New Towns Act, the creation of new towns. In particular, in the Midlands and in the Southeast, went hand in glove with policies like Greenbelt. The New Town movement was a descendant of the Garden City movement. It was about providing new opportunities for people to escape what at the stage was still the bombed out cause of our major cities, to raise their families in a new peace. And the first wave of them, as lots of you will know already, came about in the early 1950s in places like Basildon, Bracknell, Crawley, Hatfield, Harlow, Hemel Hempstead and Stevenage. Several others followed. In particular, later on in the mid-1960s, the New Towns movement brought us Milton Keynes. They were created by development corporations, lots to say about development corporations, but they were public corporations set up, sponsored and financed by central government through treasury loans, which had, through the New Towns legislation, extensive powers, planning, compulsory purchase, and indeed development. Have we been doing any of this since, say, 1980? Well, not really. As things stand today, since the Second World War, when the Clem Attlee government brought in the New Towns Act, we've created 22 new towns, and as it stands today, they are home to just under 3 million people. Now, the Labour manifesto tells us that they want some more. They want a new generation of new towns, inspired, they say, by the proud legacy of the 1945 Labour government, a series of large-scale new communities across England. They've told us that in terms of where those sites are going to be, big question obviously, that an expert independent task force is going to be set up to help choose the sites, the list of projects, and that's going to announce where those sites are within the first year of a government, so that they can start building the towns, so they say, within months, not decades, but we'll see about that. Angela Rayner gave a speech a couple of months ago to UK Reef, saying that she wanted to see homes on these sites within the first term of a Labour government, so i.e. within the next 5 years. Again, I'll just come back to that in a minute, about the realism of that proposition. They've also said that they will draft up a new towns code, which will include requirements for 40% affordable housing, tree-lined streets, locally inspired design, good links to town and city centres, guaranteed public transport and services from doctors, surgeries to schools, all sorts. So how realistic is the aspiration for new towns in terms of making progress and delivery, say, within the first term of a Labour government? Will it work? there are lots and lots of outstanding questions. And just to whiz through a couple, where we're going to need to find out where these sites are proposed, obviously, as soon as possible. The issues on location are, to put it mildly, intensely controversial. They will inevitably be. Even once you've chosen the where, you then have to move to the how. We're going to need some sort of new legislation in order to facilitate this fresh generation of new towns. And see what I've said already about strategic planning. New, fresh primary legislation is going to take some time. You're going to need to conduct land assembly, which is an obvious thing to say, but even with pretty punchy CPO powers for development corporations, land assembly for sites of this sort of scale could take years, not months. You're going to need infrastructure. It's obviously critical that any new towns are infrastructure-led if they're going to work at all. But how long will it be before things like broadband, hospitals, rails, roads, all the stuff that you need in order to bring forward a new town are in place and ready to go to start supporting new homes? Planning, remember that. These are schemes, of course, that are going to need some form of planning permission. And as you all know very well, planning permission in this country remains something that can take a little time. On average, for schemes that are more than 2,000 homes, as all of these new towns would be, to get from application being validated to the first homes being completed is a period of time that takes almost 7 years. Of course, for a really large scheme, like a new town, even getting to an application at all, as lots of you will appreciate, can take years, not months. This stuff's not easy. Wherever new towns are put, they are going to make, as the first generation of new towns showed us, they're going to make lots and lots of people very, very unhappy. So Labour are going to have to, if they're going to make this work, they're going to have to be prepared to expend some political capital to do it. Finance, where's all the money coming from? The Treasury that we have today may not feel so ebullient about making chunky loans to development corporations compared to Clem Attlee's post-war Treasury. The finances the public finances have changed an awful lot. So there remain major outstanding questions about where the money would come in order to deliver new towns. And indeed, the final thing I just wanted to touch on is long-term political support. In 2007, the last Labour government announced, you may remember, a proposal to build 10 what they called eco-towns. Around 50 sites were shortlisted for eco-town status. 4 of those shortlisted sites were selected to be taken forward as eco-towns. How many have been completed now as we sit here in 2024? 0. How many are even under construction as eco-towns? 1, which is one I've been working on in Northwest Bicester. That's it. And it's an awfully, awfully long way from completion. So the point of that is that if this is going to happen at all, it's going to take not just one term, but multiple terms of a Labour government in order to really bring these solutions about. The Eco-Town programme was dropped by the coalition government in 2010, and so it was never brought forward to fruition. And so we're going to have to see, obviously, what happens now. Even if we did build out new towns, would it be a solution? And the short answer is not on its own. We've got a shortfall in this country already, an existing shortfall of well over 4 million homes. If you take, as I've said, all the new towns that we built since 1950, you add them all up, under 3 million people live there. And what we can derive from that is that new towns can be, of course they can be, enormously powerful, valuable, and all of that. But they're not close. They're not really anywhere close to being a full solution for the needs of housing and other sorts of development that we've got. So I think we should all have a healthy skepticism on the extent of change these wider macro mechanisms can deliver within a decade, let alone within a 5-year parliament. And what that means to me is now is the time for Labour, if they're ever going to do it, to really maximise what they can do quickly and what they can do without new legislation, which takes us back to the development management related changes to the framework and interventions, which are points that people have already touched on. Thank you very much. I'll pass back to Ashley for some questions.
Zach, thank you very much indeed. We have an awful lot of questions, and we won't be able to get through all of them just to manage expectations, but we will certainly for the Landmark people's perspective. I don't want to volunteer, Nikita, but be very happy to answer them after the event by email. What we're trying to group them thematically. So one question perhaps for you, Zach, is about how these changes are likely to come into effect. Is there likely to be consultation before the MPPF or PPG or written ministerial statement? And if not, how do you think it might all work and come about? Any thoughts on that?
Good question. That's a very good question. Lots of people have been interested in that. What can we expect and when? Well, about a week and a half ago, the Times reported the Labour Party's intention to produce a new draft MPPF this month, i.e. within the month of July, before the end of the month. That would be put out for consultation, with the anticipated course being that a new MPPF would be adopted by the new government within their first 100 days. That would take us to mid-October. Is there, some of you have asked, a legal requirement to consult on this new MPPF? Probably not, as the High Court indicated that the framework's been changed before without an expectation that it necessarily needs to be consulted on. Obviously, it also has been consulted on at other times, but not always. So they probably don't need to consult on the MPPF legally, but they are going to do it in all likelihood if anything substantive's changing. I think the real question about the MPPF that we're going to get this year, so i.e. the one in July that's going to be adopted in October, the real question that we should be asking is what's going to be in it, i.e. is it going to be a short-term tweak to roll back the changes from the December 2023 version of the framework that we've been labouring under, or are they going to take the opportunity at this early stage to do something more radical? And most of the rumours I've heard suggest the former, the short-term tweak with a more radical MPPF around the corner maybe next year. I've got to say for myself, given all the things I've been saying about the difficulties of bringing forward short-term boosts to housing land supply, I'd rather hope that Labour use the political headwind while they've got it and do something a bit punchier.
Yeah, thanks very much, Zach. And perhaps Isabella, just on the development management front, a few questions about design codes as an aid to good design that the new government says is one of its priorities. Any thoughts on that? Is that something we're likely to see?
I think there have been pretty clear statements from both Angela Rayner and Matthew Pennycook that design codes will feature quite prominently in their proposals for new towns. I think more broadly across the board, I mean, there's a world in which you could read across those statements sort of a general support, but I think really they have been notably silent on design and sort of in the MPPF generally. And tying onto the point that Zach just made a moment ago, I think there's a world in which the draft MPPF that we see later this month doesn't really do anything in relation to design, because the headline policy in terms of exemplary design is something that's secured by the MPPF that we already have.
Yeah. So likely to be continued. Just a few questions about how all this will interact with current local policy. I mean, obviously the presumption at section 38(6) remains, which is in favour of the adopted parts of the development plan, unless material considerations indicate otherwise. So new MPPF policy will remain a material consideration, which may advise, sometimes in strong terms, but cannot dictate a departure from the development plan. And that will be for individual decision takers, local authorities and inspectors on appeal to resolve and decide in their judgment whether it merits departure. With one exception, of course, which is whether the new government chooses to bring into force the amendments to section 38 and introduce a national development management set of policies for England. Those would take the force of the statutory development plan, in that section 38 to be tweaked to require determination in accordance with the plan and national development management policies. So that would be one exception if they chose to do that. But if they don't, then it would just be in the category of the MPPF and PPG at the moment. So we've had a few questions about the infrastructure levy, and perhaps Nikita, if you could give us any clue that you've been able to deduce what the incoming government's views are on that, or whether they might keep it all the same. Nikita.
Yeah, sure. I've seen quite a few questions about sort of what's in the current LURA and what might be kind of carried forward. And obviously that is one of the questions. Infrastructure levy, it's the Labour manifesto, and indeed sort of throughout the campaign, they've been silent on whether or not that infrastructure levy will be brought forward. I think it's unlikely given the fact they don't mention it in their manifesto, but certainly they don't say they're not going to bring it forward. So I think, I mean, you can't, the question was, will they stick to their promise not to introduce it? I mean, I think you can't write it off, but I think certainly it's worth remembering that the LURA is a Tory Act of Parliament, and certainly they might pick and choose some of the things they want to bring forward from it. Obviously, one of the things I mentioned being CPO reform or changes to compensation rules, but I think the infrastructure levy seems one that might not see the light of day. There was also another question on environmental outcome reports. Obviously, that's another one that's in the in tray of the incoming Secretary of State. And we're in a position, I think, where there's still yet to be a response to the consultation that closed, was it about a year ago, on an environmental outcome report. So again, not sure whether that one they will see the light of day, or indeed how that's going to be taken forward. But I certainly think that it seems unlikely, given we're in a position where, well, they haven't mentioned it again in their manifesto, but also I think there's obviously been waning enthusiasm for Brexit, and I think it might be just easier to retain the current system that we have. There's a lot that's on the agenda for this incoming Secretary of State, and we've talked about so many different changes that I wonder if this is one that's probably lower down on their list. But I'm personally, I think there's a lot to be said for environmental outcome reports, and certainly an outcomes-based approach may be something that would be worth looking at in light of some recent case law. So yeah, not sure. I think probably crystal ball to know exactly what they'll bring forward, but there's certainly a lot of LURA that's yet to be switched on, and there's potential there, but a lot more work to be done on secondary legislation, guidance, etc.
Yes, that's really helpful. Thank you very much, Nikita. And perhaps as a kind of round-up question to Zack, will it all work? Which is one of the repeated points that we've had in the question and answer session: some weariness, some skepticism, further reform, more complexity. Will it actually deliver? Is there anything in there that we think will actually unlock these 1.5 million houses?
This is how I would approach it. The questions that the manifesto asks, the levers that it identifies, the issues that it raises, are, to me anyway, as a practitioner, as we all are in the coalface of this, trying to actually move the dial, they're the right questions. These are the right levers. These are things that, yes, they have been tried before and they've not always worked, but they have sometimes worked. And when we've achieved things in terms of mass development in this country, these are the ways that we've done it. But have they the will and the sense of urgency to actually make the changes over the next, and literally the next few months, to put us into a situation where we can reverse the declining number of local plans being adopted, the declining number of housing completions, housing starts, planning permissions being applied for, planning permissions being granted, and actually get to what would be a level of house building that we've not seen in this country for half a century. It's going to be really, really hard. And I'll tell you one thing. I think that we should all be looking to what the proposed changes to the NPPF are in the next month or two, because if what it is a tweak, the tweak that I've alluded to, a tweak to a sort of, say, a September 2023 version of the NPPF or something similar to that, in my eyes, that it's not going to be enough. In order to have even an outside chance at achieving something as, in the end, as bold, as radical as 1.5 million homes, or indeed say 3 million homes over the course of 2 parliaments, say, even if 1.5 wasn't achieved in the first parliament, the NPPF, for starters, is going to have to change. And it's really going to have to change, I think, in quite a fundamental way, in a way that's going to make some people really uncomfortable. But as I said, I mean, I'm no politician. But it seems to me if you're going to do something which is going to make you unpopular, or which risks making you unpopular with segments of the population, when better to do it than in the first month or two after you've been swept into government with a landslide. But we'll see.
Well, if you're listening, any members of the incoming administration or civil servants, the advice is to spend some of that political capital before it reduces by inflation over time. But it's been our absolute pleasure to share our immediate thoughts with you today. From all of us, myself, Zack Simons and Isabella Buono at Landmark Chambers and Nikita Sellers at Town Legal, we wish you a very nice weekend and look forward to debating these issues going forward.